I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Zachary Kallenborn, a policy fellow in the Center for Security Policy Studies at George Mason University, research affiliate in unconventional weapons and technology at START, and senior risk management consultant at the ABS Group. Zachary has an MA in Nonproliferation and Terrorism Studies from Middlebury Institute of International Studies and a BS in Mathematics and International Relations from the University of Puget Sound. His work has been featured in numerous international media outlets, including the New York Times, Slate, NPR, Forbes, New Scientist, Wired, Foreign Policy, the BBC, and many others. He joins us today to discuss the horrible ways that people kill one another using drone swarms, weapons of mass destruction, and apocalyptic terrorism. So Zachary, welcome, sir. Let me start with our show title, Kamikaze Drones with Hand Grenades. This is something that we're starting to see the Ukrainians using against Russian forces in the war. What can you tell me about this?
Yeah, so we've increasingly seen drones all across the board being used in this conflict, from kamikazes to simple commercial drones. And I think this reflects just the broader ubiquity of these systems now, where we're seeing it all over the place, where they've gotten so cheap and so easy to use that all sides are using these systems. These aren't necessarily confined to large, great military powers who are investing hundreds of $billions in their military systems. These are fairly simple things. And it's significant because it allows folks to get much greater access to the air, even really low levels. Like, you don't need a big fancy A-10 Thunderbolt flying to provide a whole bunch of support. All you really need is a simple kamikaze drone that can search around, blow up a target.
Yeah, well, in terms of drone warfare, one of the things that kind of caught my eye about this, it was that the U.S., for example, has been using remotely piloted Reaper aircraft, right? Those Reaper drones to deliver Hellfire missiles for decades. But this seems like it's the first time that lightweight quadcopters have been used to kill, right?
Yeah, so I would disagree a little bit that it's the first time. I think it's certainly a change from what we've seen, in that, so drones have actually been used for a very long time. So the first original drone use was the Kettering Bug back in World War I. It's a relatively simple system. I believe it was like basically a converted biplane type thing. But we haven't seen to the same sort of extent, and certainly the amount of attention. Like, drones have gotten tons of attention in recent years, primarily because of the war on terror, because drones are a fairly effective system for that, where you sort of fly above like the mountains of Afghanistan, looking around, wait for it till you see the terrorists and then blow it up, where you're looking at a much more narrow precision strike versus, a more traditional massive battlefield configuration. And that's what we're seeing now, though, is that sort of massive battlefield configuration. And we've also seen a little bit in the recent Azerbaijan-Armenia war as well, where drones played a fairly significant role, as well as some of the recent conflicts in Libya, as well as some in Syria. But that is, relatively recent. And I think we're seeing this because the technology has become so reliable and so simple, in which simply going and buying even a commercial drone, off the shelf, you can just equip a bomb to it, explosive, something like that, and that can have actually really meaningful military effects, even though really this is a simple technology. And so I think that's why we're seeing so much attention on it, and particularly where we've seen it in this particular case on both sides. Like, there's been a lot of debate among experts around whether drones would have any relevance at all in great power conflict, as folks argued, well, sure, it'll be fine in like Libya or like, these small little states, like someone like Russia, the United States, they have advanced air defenses, they have radar, they have all sorts of integrated air defense systems and everything in between. So it's probably not going to be that big of a deal in those types of conflicts at all. But what we're seeing in Ukraine and Russia is that that's not the case at all. They've been incredibly effective. The Bayraktar TB2, for example, the Ukrainian used system, has accounted for something like 80 or so various kills, including some very high profile, like supporting the destruction of the Moskva, the Russian flagship. And so rather than being sort of a little sideshow, like, they played a pretty important role. I don't know if I would go so far as to say like that they were decisive, but I can certainly say that they've been a critical and in-demand capability by both countries. And everything from those little tiny quadcopters that can help roam about, guide artillery fire to make sure you're hitting the right targets, from those larger TB2 type systems that are carrying out big attacks on their own.
Yeah, it just seems like it's definitely a paradigm shift, right? And again, going back to the Reaper, it's a larger, basically, it's a small aircraft, and it's remotely piloted, but it's piloted like an aircraft.
Hmm.
And it's a very expensive unit. It's large enough to carry a full-size missile. I mean, these are, this is definitely aircraft size.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing these tiny little commercial drones that are, originally used to carry cameras. Now they're being used to kill. So
Mhm.
that for me, when I saw that, I said, wait a minute, we're seeing a paradigm change. And that was the
Mhm.
part that kind of got me on it. Well, so if it's okay, let me try and share my screen. I want to play a couple of videos. I got the sound turned off on these.
Sure, go for it. It's quite interesting, especially those little goggles he has on there.
Yeah. And you can see, I mean, he flew it. It looks like it went right in the door.
And it's fascinating the way you get that like direct look on the target there and what's happening. And boom.
Yeah. These are also being used against larger vehicles. That one is
Mhm.
being used against a tank.
It's also amazing just how much visibility it gives into like the actual, details of the battlefield where, you can see these live shots of here's what's going on immediately.
Yeah. So, from what I've read, the Ukrainian military has been primarily using something called the Ram 2 kamikaze drones, which were actually developed by a consortium of Ukrainian companies, have a range of about 18 miles, and can carry up to 6-pound warheads. What was also interesting about that was these were bought with money that was crowdfunded by ordinary Ukrainians. So again, we have a lot of different technologies and social trends. They're all kind of packing together into this conflict. Um,
Hmm.
so these aren't necessarily commercial drones, but they're designed in a commercial drone manner. Are
Hmm.
you familiar with kind of those quadcopter styles that are being used there a little bit?
Yeah, so I think what's that point about like sort of like convergent social trends I think is really interesting. Like you have that sort of social media aspect, you have that affordability aspect as well as sort of often that relationship towards commercial technology where they aren't necessarily purely commercial, but they do rely heavily on some of these systems. And they're not really all drastically all that different. And I think we've seen that in like multiple levels, like when it comes to like the drone warfare. We've also seen sort of that crowdfunding with like the Bayraktar TB2, where a number of countries, put together, I think it was Lithuania, crowdfunded like several $1 million to afford the system. And then Bayraktar ended up, giving it away for free because this is a great system. And the way that like those videos, like you said, they've garnered so much attention towards the war, both in terms of like creating that visibility on like what's happening on the battlefield, as well as sort of like a symbolism of what the technology is. And I think, yeah, that commercial aspect is a big part of that. That many of the systems really are not drastically different from some of these commercial systems. Yeah, there's going to be some details like you don't need a commercial quadcopter to be able to withstand jamming, or you're not really worried about getting GPS denial or that sort of thing. But for the most part, the basic, airframe is, more or less the same. It's a simple drone that carries stuff in the air and drops stuff and blows stuff up, that type of thing. Well, I suppose to blow stuff up in a commercial context, but dropping things and having some sort of variable payload. But I think what's also interesting is sort of the second, third order implications of that. That is, if you have these commercial systems, one of the challenges, like, okay, where do you get that, and to what extent can you do that? So in both sides of the Ukrainian Russia conflict, you've seen a huge interest in trying to get together, like buy up DJI drones. You've also had efforts like to reach out to civilians and ask like just people in the country like, oh, hey, could we donate some of these drones, go be a part of the war effort? And it's just like the really simple stuff that you're playing around with at home can be really, really useful. Which also means that there's sort of an interesting question about sort of the role of those companies and how does their decisions affect the actual outcome of the war. Like with some of these DJI drones, for example, question is, okay, what does DJI decide to do? And there's been concerns about like, are they sharing information? How are they dealing with? There's been a lot of questions about remote identification, that is like the ability of the DJI basically puts out a signal that can help identify like where the controller is. And so naturally in a war context, you kind of want to turn that off because then you're just going to get blown up by artillery if the adversary knows where you are. So there's been some folks who've been working, they found workarounds for this, but then there's questions about, well, is DJI going to like patch this and make it go away? Which, even if they're doing it for security and safety of their system, that could end up having a pretty real effect on the actual war. But it's a commercial company making decisions about all of these things. And the final interesting aspect that comes out of that is like to the extent that you get and can sustain larger munition stockpiles of these systems, because in theory these systems are, if they're kamikaze, they're sort of blowing themselves up. And just because they're cheap doesn't mean that you have an unlimited number. Even if you can afford them, you're going to always be limited by the production capacity, as well as any particularly unique components that go into that. So which means you need big stockpiles, because over time you're going to start running out of these systems. And I think that's also what we've seen in on both sides of the conflict there, where they're trying as hard as they can to find stockpiles of these systems, where Russia is going out to Iran, well, I go, hey, let's get a bunch of Shaheeds. When Ukraine is reaching out to civilians and having large efforts to get these sort of commercial drones really wherever they can, because they become so valuable and you run out of those stocks over time.
Yeah, well, there's an asymmetrical aspect to this as well. You mentioned the Shaheed. So Russia is using drones. They are launching attacks on Ukraine with Iranian-made HESA Shaheed 136 models, which are kamikaze drones that look like an oversized remote-controlled aircraft. Now, they fly close to 200 miles an hour. They have a 1,000-mile range, and they carry an 88-pound explosive. So these are much larger than what the Ukrainians are using. However, they also cost about $20,000 a piece. So in a sense, the Ukrainians are using inexpensive, lightweight, short range, low power devices. And the Russians are relying on something that's, a little bit heavier and a lot more expensive. So it is interesting to see, drones are being used by both sides. They're being used with apparently very good levels of effectiveness, but they're being used in slightly different ways because of the cost and range and size.
Yeah, I would push back a little bit. Like, I think both sides have pretty much used the full gamut, because like Russia has also used a bunch of like simple DJIs as well.
Okay.
Like these have gotten a bit more attention because you haven't seen Russia use like a TB2 type equivalent. So it's a little bit different now for Russia to start being used sort of the larger and more expensive, because we have also seen Ukraine use like the TB2. But it's also, I think, important that gets an issue sort of like broader air power and air defense and air superiority aspects. That is, like, to the degree that Russia has a much stronger air force in general, they don't necessarily haven't needed those like a TB2 Predator type system, like, because they just have regular air power, so they don't really need it. But Ukraine hasn't, and so Ukraine has made more use of some of those larger drones, in part so that they can have some of that greater air access. But I mean, to the larger point of sort of cost and availability, I think that Shaheed example is really important as it relates to like that munition supply, especially over time, where I don't think anyone really expected Russia to be reaching out to Iran to being supplied the war effort. Even what are we at, like 8 months now, something like that, into the war? I don't think we really expected that to happen at all. And I think that part alone, I think, is fairly important, because it shows that sort of importance of maintaining and holding those stockpiles. And I think that also has larger references for the United States and other countries. There's been various reports around American support, not specifically of drones, but I believe including drones, of just general precision guided missiles and munitions have been running low, like in American stockpiles, because we've sent so many over to Ukraine to support them, which is great. I think that was the right thing for the United States to do. But you can imagine, okay, what happens if, for whatever reason, unfortunately, Americans go to war tomorrow? What's going to happen if we don't have any of those PGMs? We're probably not going to reach out to Iran to, support our stockpiles. But, you can imagine a similar type situation where you have to sort of settle with systems that we might not otherwise choose. It might be a little bit surprising simply because we have those stockpiles. So that becomes an open question. Like, okay, how do you ramp up production? How do you ensure that, production can maintain over time? And then, well, what do you do if it runs out?
Yeah. Well, this opens the door to so many different questions. And one of the things that blows my mind is where the insanity of this warfare seems to be going. I mean, I was just thinking back when I was writing the questions to when I was a kid. The media back then was worried about, a single terrorist wearing an explosive vest. That evolved into IEDs during the Iraq War, and it seems to be evolving again into basically flying IEDs. So, would it be fair to say that the pace, intensity, and lethality of warfare is increasing pretty rapidly right now?
To some extent, but I think it depends a lot on sort of like the time frame of focus. Like I think it certainly has perhaps increased over the past few years, but that's only because we've sort of, I don't want to say solved, but have gotten at least used to some of the problems of the past. Like you know, think about like the reaction to IEDs like early in the Iraq War. Like then it was like people freaking out. It was a really huge thing. People were really worried about it. As we sort of got used to it, we figured out kind of had a sense of how do we deal with these? Okay, we can figure out how to deactivate, you know, the remote detonators and that type of thing. And we know what to look for, kind of more or less. We know to like disrupt the places where they build. And then over time, it sort of becomes, you know, more comfortable. I think what's significant is that we're not as used to drones yet. Like, how do we deal with this problem? And so I think I buy that it has that feeling of like, okay, rapid pacing, rapid lethality, but I don't know that it's really changed all that much. And I think we would expect to see over time as we get more used to it, we figure out what are the best countermeasures, how do we use them effectively, and get those down to like the really really low levels where like even just, you know, what happens if we just have counter drone training and like basic, maybe not basic training, but like relatively early on in like army and soldiers career, that they're prepared and they know how to deal with these type of problems. When you start integrating at those low levels, then it becomes more of just like, okay, this is an everyday problem, right? Like, because I think warfare will always be very pacing and will always be very lethal, and we're going to constantly see these sort of changes. Like if you look at, okay, what did World War One, what did World War II look like? Those didn't really have drones to the same extent. There was a little bit, but like those are all incredibly lethal, incredibly horrifying wars, and even without this necessarily technology. And certainly, if you look back through history, we've seen that same sort of dynamic is, you know, because warfare is ultimately about, you know, ability to create harm to someone, you're constantly going to have that treadmill of like developing a new technology. We get really scared. There's this new technology, develop countermeasures to it. Okay, we're kind of okay with this. We know how to deal with this. And then we're going to build some new technology that is now again like scary and makes people worried, and you sort of, and I think we can continue to expect to see that on and on to the future insofar as like war continues to exist. And certainly I think it's unlikely that that's going to go away anytime soon.
Well, the scary part of this started, I think, in 2017 with a video called Slaughterbots, and that scared a lot of people. It scared me when I first saw it. It basically dramatized a near future scenario where swarms of inexpensive micro drones use AI and facial recognition to assassinate political opponents. You know, so in that video, it was basically a micro drone with something like a 22 caliber bullet. And you know, the way that they created the video and staged it and filmed it, it was terrifying in a way. And you know, it came out later and they said, look, this is a dramatization, this is where things are going. It seems like we're almost there.
Yeah, I think so. But I think it depends a lot on the context, and there's a lot of nuance there to unpack. So
Yes.
we are there in a literal sense in that. So Israel last year became the first, I think it was March-ish, became the first state to use an actual drone swarm in combat. They used about, I think, a couple dozen or so drones that they were communicating, they were coordinating towards shared objectives, searching around, looking for terrorists in Gaza, and then they relayed information back to like the IDF soldiers, say, okay, that's a terrorist or not, and then the IDF then approved actual attacks. So it's not exactly slaughterbots in that there was not facial recognition. It wasn't, the systems weren't deciding like, okay, that's a terrorist, I will go blow them up now, or that's a politician or whoever. But I think it does speak to what is a potential larger trend in the sort of access. So when it comes to these sort of true drone swarms, I think from like a terrorist perspective, it's plausible you'll get that technology, but I think it's very much on the upper end of the capabilities. We've seen terrorists use drones, absolutely. But if you start integrating all of those complexities, facial recognition, automated explosives, and getting the drones to all work together as like a slaughterbots type thing, it becomes harder. It's not impossible, but it's just harder. That said, I think it's worrying. I don't think you even have to get to the slaughterbots level to get to the worrying potential aspects of it. Because like one of the things that are significant about drones is because of that like cheapness and that commercialization we've been talking about, you know, this whole time, is that it also means that it's cheap and commercial for terrorist actors. And what that potentially allows is them to throw more and more drones at a particular target until it's overwhelmed. And depending on the target, especially if we're talking about, say, like a world leader or political figure, you don't actually need to be all that successful. You know, when you throw 20 drones, and even if 19 of them get knocked down to the side, but a single one hits, you know, some congressperson or whatever, that's a huge victory for the terrorist organization, even though, you know, 19 of those got shot down. So they don't necessarily need that huge swarm. And that's the challenge, that with a lot of these counter drone systems, they aren't actually really all that well equipped to take in to respond to and detect multiple large numbers of drones coming at once. So even below the slaughter boss level, I think it's worrisome. But when you start getting to the slaughter boss level, I think there are some particularly terrifying things very much like that. Like, okay, what happens if you have, say, a terrorist, probably some state-sponsored actor or fairly well-resourced terrorist, probably not Steve Joe, who read some ISIS propaganda online and was like, let's go kill people. Probably not him, but, you know, theoretically, a larger group could conceivably do this. Where, say, you know, you release a bunch of drones in a parliament building that have them specifically look for, using facial recognition and targeting, Congress people who voted against legislation that the terrorist group really supports. And so rather than just blowing the building up and doing a bunch of harm, you only target those individuals that you actually care about. Because as much as like terrorists get attention for like killing civilians, often they don't necessarily want that. Some do, and some don't care. But often terrorists are actually sensitive to civilians. They do want to only kill the people that they perceive as enemies. So if you can only target those like evil Congress people in their mind, then you can potentially have like essentially weapon of mass discriminatory terrorism, where you just only hit these really pinpoint strikes against people that you don't really like.
Okay. Well, so now one of the other things, and again, this is kind of something that you've touched on, is, you know, a single drone can be piloted easily by a single person, right? It's complex, but it's not that complex. When you start to get into drone swarms, you start to get into these complex behaviors, especially when they have to operate, you know, in parallel with each other. Then you start to move towards this increasing level of automation, right? And it seems to me like that the human element starts to move off to the distance. Now, hopefully at some point there will always be a person making the final decision on this. But one of the things that I recently read was an article saying, okay, there may be some circumstances where the machine actually makes the decision to kill itself. So it seems like, to me, it seems like there's an arms race underway to develop most, if not all, of the robotic killing machines that we saw in the Terminator. And one of the things that I can't help but wonder was that movie, that series, was a cautionary tale, but it seems like we're using it as a blueprint. I mean, why aren't we asking ourselves these difficult questions, I guess, before we just race headlong into this area of technology?
Yeah, so it's a tough issue, I think. So I want to jump back to like the sort of matter of autonomy and sort of where that's going, and build up to a more direct answer to your question. Like, I think that's right, that like, particularly as drones like become more integrated and become more of them, I think you have to have that autonomy. So for example, India was recently showed off at their Army Day parade a swarm of, I think it was like 75 drones. And the announcer was talking about that they actually want to make a swarm of 1,000 drones. Like, if you start having 1,000 drones, there's no way you could have human control over that. There's just no way. That just can't happen.
Yeah.
Even if you narrowly constrain it to like individual targeting decisions, if there's 1,000 of them, like, that's not going to happen. I guess you could probably have like 500 people all watching the monitors, but like, that's not a realistic thing at all. So I do agree with that. And the problem we also get into is sort of the error of that. That is, many of these machine vision systems and artificial intelligences tend to be fairly brittle when it comes to recognizing targets. That is, like a single pixel change can potentially fool the system. Now, I would expect like defense manufacturers to be, you know, working to try and make them more reliable. But the problem is, you know, the military contexts are always incredibly chaotic. You might have explosions, smoke, fog. Things will come in and out of the battlefield that you didn't expect. Things will be in a different position. You know, your tank won't just be sitting in an empty field that you see, oh, that's a tank. It might be, you know, it might be trees, buildings, all sorts of things in the way. And so the problem is, like, if these systems make mistakes and they're not very reliable, that's a huge problem. So like, in my view, like, drone swarms are potential future weapons of mass destruction, and that they combine that potential uncontrollability, unreliability with very huge amounts of harm. Now, I think that's more at the upper end of the spectrum. Like those couple dozen that Israel was using, I'm not super concerned about that, you know, because humans did have a control. It's a relatively small amount, and that seems like not really that big of a deal. But yeah, I do agree at the upper end. I think to the question of sort of what we're doing about the ethics, I think it's a tough one because the challenge is like with other systems that we've tended to ban, like chemical weapons, biological weapons, nuclear weapons, in almost every case, we've seen the implications of what they look like on the battlefield. Like we saw in World War I with the horrors of chemical warfare and, hanging out in trenches with mustard gas in chlorine and all sorts of other things and all like the horrible, horrible symptoms that happen with that. We haven't seen that with drones. We haven't seen that with drone swarms. And to some extent, it's a slightly different dynamic in that, like, some of the horrors that you get with chemical warfare is like some of the horrible things that happen in your body, like, dry land drowning, where you kind of like mucus fills up in your lungs and you basically choke to death based on your own like mucus. That's not really the case with drones. Not that, blowing someone up is any more pleasant, but it's at least more consistent with, how typical warfare looks like. And I think that's the challenge, is that like for like the United States and great power militaries, like they see very clear advantages in some of these autonomous technologies. And I think they're right to do so, because I think there are just potentially so many applications of drone swarms as well as drones and autonomous weapons. And we see that, in Ukraine and Russia, like how important these systems are. So it's understandable that many of these countries, like they don't want to just immediately give up a capability that they may see as useful. But I think there are at least some discussions about like what we do about it to some extent. Like, for example, current Department of Defense policy is captured in 3000.09, which basically requires, I think it's like reasonable, the appropriate amount of human control on these systems, which is vague, but it does imply that like there's going to be some judgment that, and I think that's correct, because like if we think about a autonomous gun turret that's, say, protecting a ship at sea from incoming missiles, aircraft, that sort of thing. Even if it's entirely autonomous and it messes up completely, the risks of harm are pretty minimal. Like if you're sitting in the middle of the ocean, like nothing else around you, like unless there happens to maybe be like a commercial flight going over, or say like a I don't know, cruise ship or something like that going through, like it's pretty minimal risk of something actually happening. By contrast, if you're in a super dense urban environment where there's civilians, there's cars all over the place, there's people walking their dogs, there's apartment buildings, your potential for mistakes becomes huge. And I think the problem is how we separate those two and figure out where the things that are really, really risky and that we really worry about from a technological perspective, from what are those things that are actually really valuable from a military perspective that maybe don't really have that much risk. And I think the conversation needs to very much focus on that. But I do agree that there's sort of a larger conversation that needs to happen, even at like just the global citizenry level, not only at the government level. Like, okay, under what circumstances does it seem okay for robots to kill?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and we saw this with the Reaper drone, right? And like, so one example in that scenario is if you have pilots on an aircraft carrier taking off, in F-18s or something along those lines, flying sorties, one of the issues that you run into is, especially in wartime conditions, they're on and off in the air. They're getting tired. A lot of them are living on go pills for extended periods of time, and so it becomes dangerous to the pilot. They become prone to making mistakes. You run into issues with exhaustion and poor judgment and fatigue and all sorts of stuff. Whereas with a Predator drone, since it's controlled from someplace in the United States, if the operator is tired, they can literally just get up out of their chair and hand it off to someone who's fresh. So there's an advantage there. Another advantage is, especially in the case of autonomous, I mean, it's not just drones, there are also autonomous tanks being developed, all sorts of autonomous vehicles right now. And one of the big advantages there is when American soldiers get killed, it's a big deal and it's an expensive deal. And when American soldiers get wounded, it's even worse, right? And so the United States military has not only moral and ethical obligations to protect our soldiers, they also have financial and economic obligations as well. It makes sense to go to autonomous system because the cost of actual human lives lost on our side are so great. So it seems to me like we're just going to keep seeing these things progress. And in many ways, it saves lives, right? In some ways, it saves lives.
I think so. I think the question is sort of where it goes over the future. So to start off, like, I think it's important to unpack, like we talk about the Reaper and that sort of thing. I think those are great examples, and I agree about that sort of the fatigue, lessening fatigue, and that's one of the reasons that folks are moving towards these systems. I think it's also important to unpack what exactly autonomy means. That is, autonomy is really just about the ability of a machine to do something. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a killer robot or anything like that. It just means that the drone can do something without human control. And so, like, even systems like Reaper have relatively simple autonomy. That is, like, the ability to say take off and land without human control, or fly to a designated point without human control. And like that type of autonomy can be valuable in and of itself. Like, sort of as you noted, that like, okay, you don't need the person to be sitting there and like get tired and concentrate a whole bunch on that, because the machine can sort of take it over. And there you don't necessarily have some of those ethical issues. Where I think what's interesting, though, about that sort of issue of lives saved, I think I definitely buy in the short term, but I think what's interesting is the sort of the second and third order effects of that. That is, like, because warfare is always going to be an inherently human endeavor. Like, the reason we go to war is because, like, you want an adversary to stop doing something, or you want them to positively do something, right? You want them to leave this territory. You want them to stop an invasion. You want them to stop using a particular horrible weapon system, like when we blew stuff up in Syria, that sort of thing. And so ultimately, even if machines come to dominate warfare, and I think there's some skepticism about why that is, but I buy that over time there's definitely be a much greater trend towards that. How do people respond to that? And to me, the incentives are pretty clear that, like, okay, if you have a bunch of robots on the battlefield, what you should do is not target the robots, start trying to find and kill those operators, which could be really interesting, because if those operators are sitting, in the United States or at a nearby country instead of in the battlefield, well, then the logic becomes, well, I should just go attack the United States directly, or I should go attack that battlefield. So how does that sort of change the logic of warfare? Because potentially that creates very rapid escalation risks as well. Like, even if it's preserving lives, it actually might make the war worse over the long run, and sort of being more direct targeting. Now, of course, it'll all depend on on the country and the location, because like in the United States, we have thankfully like two gigantic oceans between us and an adversary, as well as allies on both sides. So getting us in the homeland might be a little bit harder, but that's going to be different for, say, a European ally, in a future, say, Russia conflict or something like that. But to your question about sort of expansion to other domains, I think we could expect to see that. I think, though, how quickly and how successfully that'll be is still a more open question. That is, for example, like, we have seen a little bit of unmanned combat ground vehicle use. Russia used the Orlan 9 in Syria, which is just basically an unmanned tank, essentially. And it did not work very well. If I recall, like, the navigation system messed up, and it just got like stuck a bunch of times in like the middle of nowhere. Like, wasn't really all that successful. But like, I buy that the basic technology is there, because it's not super hard. Like, we have simple bomb diffusion robots that are operating on the ground. Like, we have unmanned surface vehicles like drone boats, and the Houthi rebels have used drone boats fairly successfully to carry out attacks in Saudi Arabia. So like, the technology is there, even if it's not like perfect, going to be 100% useful or reliable on the battlefield immediately today. They are increasingly being used, and there are like some examples where it has been somewhat more successful. Like, I believe Russia has also been using some unmanned ground vehicles for basically just minefield clearing, and it sounds like it's been fairly successful. I think there was a story about one getting blown up the other day, but it's also clearing mines. So better to have a robot blown up than some human operator.
Exactly.
So like, even if it got destroyed, it sounds like it was kind of doing its job. So it may have been fairly successful. And that's also a good like example of like where some of these systems may be more effective. That is, because they're in these very constrained sort of areas, you don't need to have, or like clearing a minefield, you're potentially just driving down a road, right? That's a fairly narrow, constrained thing. You kind of know what roads look like. They're pretty flat. So it's not potentially that difficult of a thing to do for some of these robots, versus, say, moving through a forest or a really cluttered urban area or field, or like forested area, or that sort of thing, which is going to be much, much more difficult.
Okay. That makes, yeah. Well, Zachary, let me thank you so much for your time today. I'm so excited to be able to have you on, because one of the things that I'm seeing is it seems like we're sliding into more lethality rather than actively deciding what the policies are ahead of time. And I mean, we can strap a missile on a Predator drone, so we do it. We can attach a hand grenade to a quadcopter, so it happens. And then after the fact, it ends up becoming standard practice, right? And so let me close by asking if and how we can add some political intentionality and take control of this on a policy level before it goes too far.
Yeah, so I think the United States, and to an extent broader great powers, need to be more engaged with the process around laws on lethal autonomous weapon systems. They've largely been a stick in the mud, and understandably so, since many of the sort of activist types have been trying to ban like all autonomous weapons, everything from the killer slaughter bots to like gun turrets in the middle of the ocean, and I can understand why the United States and others would not be down for that at all. But I think if to the degree that like the Americans and others are worried about the proliferation of these technologies, even if they want to use them themselves and being concerned about others using them, I think they have to engage more effectively with the international community and activists and even activist groups who are trying to push these, provided of course that there's a condition that there's just take complete ban off the table, because like America should never do that. It would be a really foolish idea to like give up like loitering, some of these loitering munitions or like radar based, that type of thing. But because there are real concerns, I think they need to address those. And I think it needs to go beyond like the current focus that's been in the United Nations, looking primarily under the auspices of the Convention on Conventional Weapons. That is, I think there are very real concerns and I think the United States should be very seriously concerned about the interaction of autonomy and artificial intelligence with nuclear weapons, as well as chemical and biological warfare. And I think that's something that like the United States could get on board with, because if you say have an error in a autonomous nuclear weapon, you're potentially looking at catastrophic destruction of all of humanity. And I think there's pretty much no way that the United States wants to do that. There may be a little bit of disagreement, but I think that's a pretty easy one where American interests very much align with some of the ban activists of like, this is a terrible idea, don't do that. And so I think there are conversations like that I think the United States needs to play a much more proactive role in addressing those. But I also think like the United States also just kind of needs to figure out what that policy looks like and what their approach needs to look like, especially around those non-proliferation measures and like how do we stop these weapons from spreading all over the world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It has the power to save lives. It also has the power to take lives, and it's a very complex issue. Zachary, thank you again for your time today, sir.
Thank you for having me.